All right, here we have the rise of Jim Crow, 1876 to 1890. Now, the Black Codes had left no doubt that the former breakaway Confederate states intended to maintain white supremacy at all costs. These draconian state laws helped spur the Congressional Joint Committee on Reconstruction into action. Its members felt that ending slavery with the 13th Amendment did not go far enough. So Congress extended the life of the Freedmen's Bureau to combat the Black Codes, and in April of 1866 passed the Civil Rights Act, which established the citizenship of African Americans. This was a significant step that contradicted the Supreme Court's 1857 Dred Scott decision, which declared that African Americans could never be citizens. The law also gave the federal government the right to intervene in state affairs to protect the rights of those citizens and thus of African Americans. Right? Jim Crow laws were a collection of state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation. Okay? The roots of Jim Crow began as early as 1865, immediately following the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. The codes appeared throughout the South as a legal way to put black citizens into indentured servitude by taking voting rights away, to control the way they lived and how they traveled, and to seize children for labor purposes. So, during the Reconstruction era, local governments, as well as National Democratic Party and President Andrew Johnson, thwarted efforts to help Black Americans move forward. Violence was on the rise, making danger a regular aspect of African American life. Black schools were vandalized and destroyed, and bands of violent white people attacked, tortured, and lynched Black citizens in the night. Families were attacked and forced off their land across the South. The most ruthless of these organizations in the Jim Crow era was the Ku Klux Klan, which was born in 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee, as a private club for Confederate veterans. The KKK grew into a secret society terrorizing the black community and seeping through white Southern culture, with members at the highest level of government and in the lowest of the criminal back alleys. Now, in many ways, the presidential election of 1876 foreshadowed the politics of this era, in that it's resulted in one of the most controversial results in all presidential history. The country was in the middle of an economic downturn caused by the Panic of 1873, a downturn that would ultimately last until 1879, all but assuring that Republican incumbent Grant would not be reelected. Instead, the Republican Party nominated a three-time governor from Ohio, Rutherford B. Hayes. Hayes was a political candidate who was very popular. He advocated for both hard money, an economy based on the gold currency transactions, as well as civil service reform, that is, recruitment based upon merit and qualifications, which was to replace the practice of handing out government jobs as spoils which had started during the Jackson administration. Most importantly, he had no significant political scandals in his past, unlike his predecessor, Grant. In most notorious example of the Gilded Age corruption, several congressmen accepted cash and stock bribes in return for appropriating inflated federal funds for the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. So the Democrats likewise sought a candidate who could challenge and be a champion of reform against growing political corruption. They found their man in Samuel J. Tilden, who was the governor of of the state of New York, and a self-made millionaire, who had made a successful political career fighting corruption in New York City, including spearheading the prosecution against Tammany Hall boss William Tweed. So both parties tapped into the popular mood of the day, each claiming to champion reform and promising to end the corruption that had become so rampant in Washington, D.C. Now, both parties promised an end to the post-Civil War Reconstruction. The result of the election ultimately was very close. Tilden won the popular vote by nearly 300,000 votes. However, he only had 184 electoral votes. You need 185 to be proclaimed the formal victor. 3 states, Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina, were in dispute due to widespread changes in voter fraud and miscounting. Questions regarding the validity of one of these 3 electors in Oregon cast further doubt on the final vote. However, that state subsequently presented evidence to Congress confirming all 3 electoral votes for Hayes. What ends up happening as a result of this disputed election is the House of Representatives establishes a special electoral commission to determine which candidate won the challenged electoral votes of these 3 states. In what later became known as the Compromise of 1877, Republican leaders offered Southern Democrats an enticing deal. If they found in favor of Hayes, Hayes would then order the withdrawal of the remaining U.S. troops from those 3 Southern states, thus allowing the collapse of radical Reconstruction governments of the immediate post-Civil War era. This move would permit Southern Democrats to end federal intervention and control their own state's fate in the wake of the end of slavery. It works. Hayes is inaugurated as president, and so begins the corruption. And what this also does, by ending the radical Reconstruction in the South and the presence of the military there to enforce the Civil Rights Act of 1866, with this removal now, instead of troops from the North protecting African Americans in the South, you can see the image on the left, we now have the image on the right, where Northerners and Southerners are in agreement that the African Americans are on the bottom, the rest of us are on the top. Now, there was legal discrimination on top of everything else. Jim Crow laws, which I've discussed, poll taxes where you have to pay a tax in order to vote, literacy tests where you had to prove that you could read, or grandfather clauses where you had to have a grandfather who had voted in a former election early on and it could be proved on the poll. So literacy tests were especially discriminatory, as slaves were not allowed to learn to read. And in doing so, former slaves could not read very well or at all. So we have the beginning of true segregation in a sense. Segregation laws become enforced. The legal principle of separate but equal racial segregation was extended to public facilities and transportation. So facilities for African Americans were consistently inferior and underfunded compared to facilities for white Americans. Sometimes there were no facilities for the black community at all. So Jim Crow institutionalized economic, educational, and social disadvantages of African Americans living in the South. They did not just affect the South. Understand that Jim Crow laws existed in the North as well. There was also racial violence. African Americans who would stand up against white authority were often met by race riots or lynchings. And when I mention a lynching, I do not necessarily mean a hanging. They also would set fire to them. Now, some African Americans chose to leave the South. These were called the exodusters. Exodusters began leaving the South in droves. They were leaving and pushing westward into Kansas. In over 25,000 exodusters arrived in Kansas between 1879 and 1880 alone. By 1890, over 500,000 African Americans lived west of the Mississippi River. Although a majority of black migrants became farmers, approximately 12,000 worked as cowboys during the Texas cattle drives. Also, some became known as Buffalo Soldiers in the wars against Native Americans. Understand, though, that most African Americans chose to remain in the South. One of these is an example of Booker T. Washington, who established the Tuskegee Institute to teach vocational skills to African Americans so that they could learn a skill to work at a job. The Tuskegee Institute would go on to be Tuskegee University. I will discuss Booker T. Washington and the early civil rights movement at a later date. Understand that Jim Crow laws touch every aspect of an African American's life during this time period. What started with slavery to then become black codes to then become Jim Crow with racial segregation, which was legalized in separate but equal case, that was not knocked down until Brown versus the Board of Education in 1968. This was aspect of African American life in United States society during this time period.